Hey guys, tonight we drift back to an island, wine-tossed and brooding, where the scent of salt and chestnut trees clings to the stone houses like old stories no one dares to finish. You can hear the shutters creak in the wind, the waves hush against the shore, and the muffled argument in the next room that you pretend not to hear. You were born on Corsica, not quite French, not quite free. It's August 15th, 1769, and the Empire has just claimed this rugged island, swallowing it whole. You're Napoleon Bonaparte then, with a name the locals still pronounce in Italian, even if your father has just surrendered it to French spelling. You're born into contradiction. French citizen, Corsican rebel's son, born just months after your people's defeat. So before you settle in, gently tap that like button and subscribe only if this kind of storytelling truly speaks to you. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it by you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You cry like all infants do, but in a house still haunted by the sounds of defeat, even your cries feel political. Your mother Letizia is barely 16, already weary. She'll outlive your empire, outlive two of her sons, outlive exile. But tonight, she simply rocks you as the shutters rattle. Outside, Corsica groans under French rule. Inside, your family clings to minor nobility, poor and proud, with 11 children to feed, though not all will survive. You're the second son, sickly and strange. You prefer solitude even as a child. You squint at the horizon, not from wonder, but calculation. You speak Italian. You dream in Italian. But soon, for the sake of opportunity, you'll be taught to speak French, a tongue that clutches your throat like a stranger's hand. Your classmates will mock your accent. Even the French won't fully accept you as one of their own. That tension, the ache of always being, almost will become a drumbeat beneath everything you do. Your father, Carlo, aligns with the French to secure his family's future. A lawyer and minor official, he trades the memory of Corsican independence for a scholarship to the French mainland for you. You're 9. Already, you've learned that identity is a currency you can't always afford to keep. The ship rocks beneath your feet as you sail toward mainland France. Corsica fades behind you like a dream, sunburnt hills, and vendetta songs echoing in the back of your memory. You're seasick, clutching the rail. A little boy, silent and sallow, already rehearsing how to disappear in plain sight. In Brienne at military school, you arrive, wrapped in poverty and pride. The sons of aristocrats strut like young peacocks. You, with your dark skin, awkward silence, and thick Corsican accent, become a target. They call you names. They laugh when you mispronounce words. They say you stink of garlic. One boy even mimics your walk arms folded behind his back nose in the air. You don't cry. You write. You watch. You walk alone. The schoolmaster notes you always look down when spoken to. But you're not ashamed, you're calculating. You already know. What they don't, someday they will kneel. At night, when the dormitory snores, you lie awake planning imaginary campaigns. Your favorite heroes aren't kings, they're strategists. Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal. You trace their movements on maps with your fingers. You memorize battles like bedtime stories, where the underdog doesn't just win, he rewrites the rules of the world. Sometimes you sneak extra bread from the kitchens, not because you're hungry, but because you will not beg. You're determined to never be small again, even if that means learning how to be invisible for a while. Quiet is your training ground. Loneliness, your sparring partner. There's a joke you make only to yourself one rainy morning. If they think I'm strange, now wait until I'm emperor, and then you laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it might actually be true. Years later, your classmates will remember you differently. Some will say you were moody, others that you were brilliant. A few will say they always knew. But none of them really knew you. Not the fire twisting beneath your calm exterior. Not the quiet vow you repeated like prayer. One day, I'll show them all. You study. You pace. You write letters to your older brother Joseph, pages filled with political opinions, mathematical problems, and melodramatic flair. You're still just a teenager, but already your writing reads like a commander issuing orders to time itself. When your father dies of stomach cancer, you're just 15. No tears. You fold the grief into your bones and double down. A small joke floats through your mind again. Someday, I'll conquer time too. But time, like empire, doesn't bend easily. It has to be tricked, outwitted, subdued. By 17, you finished your training and earned your commission. A Corsican in a French army, a boy with no money, no connections, and a name no one can pronounce. You step onto the Paris streets in a 2 large uniform boots, clicking like a challenge. No one stops to look at you, but you know how to wait. History doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in like sea mist, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. And somewhere, just beneath your skin, the Corsican wind still whispers, you were not born to kneel. You arrive at the École Militaire in Paris, the way a shadow arrives, quiet, unwelcome, unnoticed by the light. At 15, you've already buried a father and half your illusions, and now you're expected to play soldier among sons of dukes and barons. The halls smell of polish and musk, and the boys walk like they already own the future. You walk like you're memorizing the shape of failure, so you can never step in it again. You don't smile much. You rarely speak unless spoken to. And when you do, your Corsican French grates against their ears like sand in silk. They call you la paille au nez, the straw in the nose. It's supposed to be funny. You don't laugh. Instead, you devour books the way other boys drink wine. Geometry, history, artillery manuals, Livy's, History of Rome, Rousseau's political treatises. You read them all until they blur into one continuous obsession power and how it works. You study Caesar's commentaries not for glory but for strategy. You read about kings, but you don't envy their crowns. You envy their maps. You don't want thrones. You want angles and leverage and legacy. Your teachers notice. One calls you deep, strange, silent. Another remarks that you argue like a man twice your age. You correct him 3 times your age would be more accurate. At night, you scribble in notebooks until the candle guttering beside you gives up, and even then your mind doesn't stop. There's a boy named Etienne who sneers every time he passes you. You'll never be one of us, he says, adjusting his tailored coat. One day you murmur back, you're right. You'll be one of mine. He doesn't get the joke. But you do. At the fencing yard, you're not the fastest, but you're always the last one standing. Your wrist isn't as strong, but your timing is merciless. You lose often at first, but you learn with each bruise. You don't believe in talent. You believe in control, of motion, of momentum, of yourself. You begin to speak less, not more. It unnerves people. They mistake your silence for submission, not realizing you're building a cathedral of thought where their insults can't echo. Some nights, you dream of Corsica. You see your mother standing in the doorway of your childhood home, arms crossed, hair in her scarf, watching the sky as if she expects it to confess something. You don't write home often. Words feel too small. And besides, you're afraid if you remember too much, you might return. Instead, you write poetry. Bad poetry mostly. Angry, brooding verses about glory and rejection. You're still a boy after all. A boy who dreams of fire. And yet, you never show the poems to anyone. That, too, is strategy. You're mocked for your poverty. You eat less than the others because you can't afford more and because the hunger teaches you. You say no to indulgence the way a soldier might refuse anesthesia, better to feel everything, so you remember why it hurts. Then there's your exam, the final step before you become an officer. You walk into the testing chamber with your boots polished and your throat dry. A general watches from behind the examiner arms folded. He nods after only a few minutes. They say afterward, you completed the exam in half the time of your peers. They say your calculations were brutal but elegant. They also say you were forgettable in person. But your paper spoke louder than your voice ever had. You graduate early, 17. A second lieutenant in the artillery. Assigned to Valence, posted with men twice your age in a garrison that smells like damp wool and boredom. The real world doesn't feel real yet. Just another test. Just another stage. You walk the barracks slowly, learning the rhythms of discipline. You train the men like you're sculpting statues, methodical, severe, always watching. At night, you visit the library. And when that closes, you write letters to your uncle about Corsican independence. You still burn for the island, though you already know it's slipping into myth. You fall in love briefly with a local girl named Caroline. She's sweet, soft-spoken, and likes the way you brood. You don't trust it. You try to kiss her once, and then apologize for no reason. She touches your face and says, "You never stop thinking. Do you?" You don't answer. Because how do you explain to someone that your brain is a battlefield and your heart is still wearing armor? Eventually, you leave Valence behind. You're reassigned. The world begins to change. Paris is boiling revolution, rising like yeast left too long in heat. And in a whisper, not a roar, your future begins its long, slow spiral into history. But you'll always remember these early years. The mockery, the quiet hunger, the books that became your friends, the nights when you thought no one would ever say your name without laughing, and even later, when they chant it in the streets, inscribe it into monuments, whisper it in fear or awe. You'll still hear it the way Etienne first said it, like a slur, not a crown, which ironically makes it taste sweeter. You spend your 20s the way most people spend their lifetimes, waiting for lightning to strike and convincing yourself that the thunder doesn't matter. You are Napoleon Bonaparte now, no longer Bonaparte. Though the name still feels like a borrowed coat. You are posted in Toulon, a hot, restless port city that smells of gunpowder and fish guts. And for the first time in your life, history walks up to you and places something in your palm. A map. Not just any map, but one of the city's defenses. The British have occupied Toulon during the chaos of the French Revolution. The new republic is desperate. They've killed their king. They've executed generals. And they're still not sure if their enemies are outside their borders or inside their own lungs. And somehow, you, a young artillery officer, underfed, underdressed, and barely noticed, are handed the assignment to break this stalemate. You don't flinch. You calculate. You walk the terrain in silence, measure the hills, Run your fingers across stone bastions like a surgeon studying an open wound. And you see something no one else does. A weakness, a slope, a pattern. It's geometry. You tell them exactly where to place the cannons, exactly when to fire, and most importantly, where not to waste time. Some snicker. You're 24. Your accent still makes people pause before trusting your judgment. But then the cannons roar exactly where you said they should, and within days the British abandon the city in panic. You don't gloat, but you also don't pretend it was luck. Because for the first time, something shifts inside you. Validation. General de Gaumier shakes your hand. Robespierre's brother writes your name into a glowing report. And Paris, chaotic, blood-slick, terrified Paris hears it. They summon you. And just like that, you're no longer the poor Corsican who smells like sea air and too much ambition. You're a name on a list of potential saviors. You walk through the doors of government buildings with the smell of victory still on your coat, and people finally stop mispronouncing your name. One official remarks, "He has the look of a Roman bust. Cold, serious, possibly made of marble." You smile only with your eyes and say nothing. Another official offers you a drink. You decline. You never drink. Too many generals fall in love with wine and forget the map. But behind the calm exterior, you're restless. Your mind is fire under glass. The revolution doesn't feel like an answer. It feels like a spinning coin. Heads liberty, tails the guillotine. You try not to get involved in politics, but politics has already wrapped its fingers around your future. You write passionate letters, still dreaming of Corsican independence, even while building a career inside the very republic that once crushed your homeland. It's ironic, maybe even hypocritical, but you've learned something more powerful than loyalty leverage. At night, you sketch in notebooks, cannon angles, forced diagrams, but also dream scenes of conquests, ideas for reform thoughts on law and education, and how to reshape the entire continent like a sculptor reshapes stone. You joke to a fellow officer, "France is not a country. It's a mess waiting for a map." The officer chuckles. You think you can draw that map, and you shrug, but quietly you already have. Then something unexpected happens. You fall in love. Not the kind that knocks you over. The kind that confuses you. Her name is Desiree. She's young, charming, and completely different from you. Light where you're dark. Open where you're closed. It doesn't last long. But for a few months, you remember what it's like to be wanted, not just useful. You don't know it yet, but your real romance is waiting in the wings, just a few letters away. And her name is Josephine. But for now, it's the revolution that keeps you warm. Paris is in flames metaphorically and sometimes literally. Royalists threaten the city, and the government calls for help. You're just 26. No noble blood, no real connections. But one phrase from a desperate official changes your life forever. "We need someone with artillery experience." You don't hesitate. You take charge. You fire into the mob. Grape shot scatters across the cobblestone like steel rain. The uprising ends in a heartbeat, and the ruling committee gives you a nickname that will follow you into history, the savior of the Republic. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels necessary. One joke you make later, "I saved the government with a whiff of grape shot." But you don't laugh. Neither does Paris. They give you command of the Army of the Interior. You receive finer uniforms, better quarters, money, power. And for the first time, rooms go silent when you enter out of respect. But inside, you're still that boy, walking alone at Brienne, still watching, still hungry. still turning maps into mirrors and wondering what part of the world you can bend next. You start to feel it, not just belief, but destiny, humming in your bones, like distant cannon fire. You don't think you're lucky. You think you're prepared. And now the world has started handing you tools instead of reasons. Geometry brought you here. But fire is what will carry you forward. You step off the carriage into the southern heat of Nice, where the scent of oranges mixes with the sweat of soldiers, and every shadow seems to whisper, "This is your proving ground." You're 26, and they've handed you the army of Italy, a starving, threadbare force with torn boots, no morale, and a commander they didn't ask for. One officer mutters that you look like a clerk in uniform. Another sneers behind your back. That boy, he can barely see over the table. You say nothing. You've never needed volume to make yourself heard. Instead, you walk through the encampment like a surgeon preparing for a high-stakes operation. You speak to the men not from above, but from inside. You tell them they are not forgotten. You promise them bread. You promise them shoes. But most importantly, you promise them glory. You tell them, soldiers, you are naked and starving, but the richest plains in the world are before you. There you will find honor, fame, and wealth. They listen. They believe. And so begins your first real war, not with musket fire, but with imagination. You know you don't have enough bullets. You barely have food. But what you do have is the one thing more powerful than cannon's momentum. You move fast, faster than any French general before you. You surprise the Austrians before they've finished their coffee. You outthink generals who've worn medals longer than you've worn boots. In battle after battle, Montenotti, Lodi Arkell, you lead from the front, wading into the fog of gunpowder, your small frame perched atop a horse like it's an extension of your spine. You learn that your presence is as much a weapon as any saber. Soldiers fight harder when you're near. They believe the laws of death bend for you. It's not invincibility, it's illusion management. And you're very, very good at it. One night after a skirmish, you sit beside the campfire eating stale bread and scribbling notes. You're designing a bridge that hasn't been built yet, a road through the Alps, a system of supply that doesn't exist. An aide walks past and asks what you're doing. You smile softly, planning tomorrow. But the Austrians are still out there. They'll be out there tomorrow too. But the world we'll march into won't be the same. You keep dreaming, even as bodies fall, even as powder burns your eyes. You dream of an Italy united, a France renewed, a Europe that moves at your pace. You dream of law, of education, of order the kind that can outlive empires. And in the middle of all this, Josephine enters your life. You receive her letters like rainfall in drought. Her words are lush, teasing a balm against the dust and blood. She is older, elegant, and already half legend in Parisian salons. You fall fast too fast. You write her long, fevered declarations. Since I left you, I have been sad. I am unhappy. You sign them with strange boyish intensity. Death rather than separation. Bonaparte. Your officers tease you. The general is conquered, one laughs. But they don't see how the letters ground you. Amid chaos, they offer a scent of softness, a reminder that you're still human beneath the iron exterior, that someone sees you, not just the strategist, but the strange Corsican boy who used to pace dormitory halls in silence. You propose. She hesitates. You insist. She marries you, barely attends the ceremony, forgets to write. You forgive her because you're in love not just with her, but with the idea that someone like her could love someone like you. Still, you press on. In Italy, you redraw the map, not just geographically, but ideologically. You strip titles from nobles, establish republics, send art back to Paris in crates marked liberty. You're not just a general now. You are an idea. Back in France, they call you a comet. Newspapers publish your victories before your boots are dry. Crowds cheer when your name is spoken, and political leaders begin to shift nervously in their chairs. Too fast, they whisper. Too much. You feel it too, the tension rising like a string pulled taut. But you don't stop, because movement is your element. Stillness feels like death. One night you stare at a map of Europe by candlelight, and your fingers hover over Egypt. You wonder not for the first time how Alexander felt before he crossed into Asia. Did he feel this burn behind his eyes? This ache for legacy? For something more? You tell your aide, to understand the future, we must seize the past. The aide blinks. Sir, we're going to Egypt. The dream grows. And like all your dreams, it begins just behind enemy lines, where doubt sleeps and ambition whispers louder than fear. You sail under a black night sky thick with stars, as if the heavens themselves have been spilled across the sea. The waves murmur beneath your ship, like an old priest saying last rites. You are 30 years old, and you are not simply crossing water, you are trying to fold time. Egypt is not just a campaign. It is a symbol, a bridge between empires, a mirror to Alexander, a way to leap beyond the grubby violence of European politics and into the mythic. You say this aloud one evening, to no one in particular. Europe is too small. I want to leave a footprint on the world, not just on the mud. Your officers exchange glances. They don't understand the poetry, but they understand you're serious. You bring not only 40,000 troops, but 167 scholars, engineers, artists, and savants. It's an army and a library, a battalion and an enlightenment salon. No other general in history has dared to invade a land with both cannons and printing presses. You step onto Egyptian soil, and the heat hits you like a vision-blinding absolute. The desert stretches in every direction like a forgotten canvas. You breathe it in, and it smells of dust and destiny. Cairo resists. You crush it. The Mamluks ride with silk banners and curved swords. You answer with disciplined squares and rifles that speak louder than any drumbeat. At the Battle of the Pyramids, you raise your voice above the thunder and shout to your men. From these heights, 40 centuries look down upon you. It's not just a line, it's a spell. They believe you. They fight harder. The victory is fast. But it doesn't feel like triumph. Not exactly. Because in your gut, you feel the clock ticking. And back in Europe, the world is changing without you. Then disaster. At the port of Abukir, Admiral Nelson shatters your fleet. Fire on water. Splinters. Screams. You're cut off. Trapped in the sands of a land you do not fully understand. You read the British reports days later. Bonaparte's Eastern Empire stillborn. You say nothing. But inside, you grind the failure into a whetstone. Because you know the truth, timing is everything. And timing, unlike talent, can be trained. So you pivot. You become a builder. You organize hospitals, tax codes, schools. You try to teach hygiene to a city where the Nile carries both life and disease. You publish a newspaper for soldiers and locals alike. You study the ruins. You run your hand along hieroglyphs no one can yet read. One day, Inside a shattered fort, your scholars dig up something strange. A stone slab covered in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian. You hold it in your hands. It's heavy, ancient, silent. You say softly, "This will speak again." It will, of course. The Rosetta Stone will one day unlock the language of the pharaohs. But in this moment, you don't need to know how it is enough that you believe it will be done. You write home to Josephine. No answer. You write again. Nothing. You begin to hear rumors. Paris salons, her dances the other man. You sit alone in your tent at dusk, reading the same short letter over and over again, her last reply. You fold it neatly. Then you unfold it and fold it again. That night, you don't sleep. You lie awake listening to the jackals, to the wind over sand, to the sound of loss dressed as silence. Eventually, the orders come from Paris. The government, the directory is collapsing. They need you, or fear you, or both. You understand what must be done. You hand command of the army to a subordinate. You slip past the British blockade. You return to France not as a soldier, but as something else. Not quite emperor yet, but close. Close enough to taste it. You land, step ashore, walk unarmed into the center of political gravity, and before anyone can stop you, you rewrite the story. Coup d'etat, swift, surgical. You stage it like a theater performance. The chambers roar, the guards shuffle, the old politicians shout. One calls you a traitor, another grabs your lapel. You shrug him off like a coat you've outgrown. And when the dust settles, France is yours. Not by birth, not by blood, by timing. You become first consul. The Republic is preserved in name only. You smile and say, the revolution is complete. You don't mention the irony. You don't need to. Everyone feels it. You send for Josephine. She arrives days later, breathless, elegant, almost guilty. You do not speak of the letters, or the silence, or the ache that clawed at your ribs in the desert. Instead, you take her hand and say, let's begin again. And like so many things in your life, you will it into truth. The maps you once traced with shaking fingers now stretch across your desk like velvet. You move tokens across Europe as if playing chess with ghosts. But what they don't see, what you never forget, is how long you've studied the clock. Not just when to strike, but how long to wait. It begins with a touch, a simple brush of fingertips against silk, and suddenly you are not a general or a ruler or a man sculpted from logic and maps. You are just Napoleon undone by a smile. Josephine is not like anyone else in your world. She moves like water, graceful, elusive, soft, where you are stone. Where you march, she dances. Where you command, she charms. Her voice drifts through rooms like perfume, and people lean toward it as if warmth were something she could lend by accident. You married her in haste, with a kind of soldier's urgency, as if love were a campaign that could be won by momentum alone. You called her Josephine, even though her birth name was Rose. You wanted something softer, something sweeter, something that sounded like music instead of memory. She changed you, not into someone different, but into someone possible. You remember the first time she walked into a room of diplomats meant to fear you. She wore no crown, no medals, only laughter, and they bowed anyway. She understood power differently, not through domination, but through allure. You once joked, I conquer kingdoms. Josephine conquers rooms. But it wasn't really a joke. In the early years, she is your center of gravity. You return from campaigns not to celebration, but to her. When the door to your Paris apartment creaks open, when her slippers echo across marble floors, when her fingers reach for your collar before you can even speak, you remember why empires are built, not just one. And yet, there's a fracture between you. Not a break, just a hairline crack, like frost working its way into stone. She writes less. You hear whispers of letters hidden, of gentlemen callers, of sighs in moonlit gardens. You pretend not to notice. You invent reasons. She was lonely. She was unsure. She never expected to be loved like this. One night you come home early. She's at a masquerade ball, laughing in a way you haven't heard in weeks. A mask slips from her hand. A gentleman bows too low. She doesn't see you watching from the corridor. You don't confront her. You never mention it. But something inside you changes. Not anger, not betrayal. A quiet withdrawal. You return to your maps, your war rooms. You throw yourself into numbers again. Campaigns stretch longer. Letters become brief. Your heart folds back into strategy. She senses it, of course. Josephine is not foolish. She's simply used to being forgiven. One morning, she leaves a note on your desk. No apology. Just, do not become colder than the crown you seek. You don't respond. Not with words. But that afternoon, you walk together through the gardens of Ma Maison. You offer her your arm. You speak of roses. She nods, but her eyes are scanning your silence like it's a battlefield. Still you try. You give her diamonds carriages, a palace filled with parrots and rare orchids. You name her empress before the world does. You tell yourself that love like a republic can be reconstructed. Then the news. Josephine cannot give you an heir. The doctors say it softly, carefully, as if their gentleness could make the truth less sharp. You nod. You thank them. Then you leave the room before your knees betray you. You sit for hours in the gardens, where the lavender bushes sway like restless thoughts. You whisper aloud, "What is a legacy without a son?" A gardener startled nearby pretends not to hear. You don't blame Josephine, not openly. You still love her, in a way that defies policy. But France demands continuity. And you are no longer just a man. You are an institution. You wait a year. You weigh the silence between you. Then you do what feels impossible. You tell her it must end. She doesn't cry. She simply sits at her vanity removing a ring that once belonged to your mother. She places it in your palm. "You taught me how to be adored," she says, "but not how to be replaced." The divorce is public, but your grief is private. At the ceremony, you both appear in white. Your hands shake. You recite the lines. And when it is over, you kiss her hand with a reverence that startles the room. Later, a minister asks you how you're feeling. You say France must have an heir, but your voice has the rhythm of mourning. Even after your second marriage to the young Austrian princess, Marie-Louise, you never speak of Josephine harshly. Not once. Not in public, not in private. When she falls ill, you send letters. When she asks for financial aid, you send triple. When she dies, just 4 years before you, you sit alone for hours, the letter announcing her death, trembling in your hand. You whisper, "She was the only one who ever made me feel." But you don't finish the sentence, because to finish it would mean opening a wound no army could march across. Even on St. Helena in exile with your empire gone and your body hollowed by illness, you still speak her name. Not often, but softly, like a secret. like a smile. You remember Egypt not as a campaign, but as a fever, a place where reality shimmered and bent in the heat, where sand crept into your boots and your soul, where time itself forgot how to count. You return to it often in your thoughts, not the defeats, not the ships on fire, but the silence, the vastness, the sacred scale of nothingness. Paris was too small, Corsica too angry, but Egypt was eternal. You walk through ruins with your officers trailing your fingers along stones older than Christ. You tell them we are not the first. We will not be the last. But let us not pass through history like dust. They laugh politely as they always do when you speak like a prophet instead of a general. But you're not joking. Egypt changed your voice. It turned command into oratory and tactics into myth-making. You remember the night you stood before the pyramids alone. The stars were brutal with clarity, the desert wind soft as linen. And for a moment, just one, you imagined you had been here before, that your soul had marched these dunes in another body under another name. Ramses Alexander. You were always Napoleon, just waiting for history to catch up. But mirages don't last. You think of the scholars who followed you, how they unpacked their instruments like holy relics. You remember their reverence for knowledge, their joy at discovering the Rosetta Stone, how they wept when they realized they could decode the speech of pharaohs long dead. And yet, for all that enlightenment, the war was ugly. You remember the bodies piled in the heat, the plague taking your men, the British pressing from the sea, the Ottomans from land. You fought at Acre and lost. You spun reports into triumphs. You couldn't admit failure, not yet. Not while France still believed in your myth. And it was a myth, wasn't it? You became two people in Egypt, the man who fought battles, and the man who stood beside ancient gods, asking to borrow their silence. You began writing down laws, drafting a civil code in your mind, dreaming of roads, schools, banking systems art. At night, you'd lie under canvas and whisper ideas to the sand. A state must be logical. Laws should outlive the men who write them. Power is not eternal, but structure can be. Your aides thought you were speaking in your sleep. Sometimes you were. But Egypt was not a failure, not to you, because it wasn't about victory. It was about vision. You weren't there to conquer a people. You were there to practice immortality, and still it ended. You left them, your soldiers, your scholars, the land you tried to remake in your own image. You boarded a ship with a false name, dodging the British blockade like a thief fleeing a dream. When you landed in France, Paris greeted you as a hero. No one cared that you had lost. They cared that you had returned, because by now, your legend moved faster than your failures. You remember looking at the crowds cheering you, calling your name, waving tricolor banners, kissing your boots. And you whispered under your breath, "They love the idea of me more than the man." But you let them love you anyway. You'd learned that illusions once shaped become architecture. And Egypt was your foundation. You built an empire not on victory, but on the memory of a desert no one else truly understood. They called it a failure, but you called it a rehearsal for eternity. It's a cold morning in December, and you are walking through the corridors of Notre Dame Cathedral, as if time itself has slowed to let you pass. The gold glints under torchlight. The velvet breathes with perfume and candle smoke. Thousands of eyes watch your every step, but you don't flinch. Because today, you will not just be crowned emperor. You will crown yourself, No monarch in France's long, blood-soaked history has ever done this. Not Charlemagne, not the Bourbon kings, not Louis XVI, whose ghost still lingers in the minds of the old aristocracy like a bloodstain that won't wash out. But you reach for the crown with both hands, slow, deliberate, unshaking, and place it on your own head, not in defiance, in control. Pope Pius VII watches expression unreadable. He blesses you afterward, yes, but only after you have made your point. You are not God's servant. You are history's instrument. You do not beg for authority. You embody it. The crowd erupts. Trumpets rise. 1,000 hands clap. And still your mother is not there. Letizia stayed in Rome. Whether out of illness or quiet protest, you're never sure. But her absence hangs in the cathedral like an unspoken sentence. You feel it more than you hear the bells. And Josephine, radiant, in silk and diamonds, sits beside you. Her hand in yours trembles slightly. You squeeze it gently. And in that moment, both of you know this is the peak. The moment where everything gleams brightest, before time begins its slow erosion. You give her a second crown, Empress of the French. She weeps. And for a moment, you almost believe you can hold everything together. But behind the trumpets and silks, the shadows begin to lengthen. As emperor, your days are filled with edicts and code. You finalize the Napoleonic Code, a tapestry of logic, rights, order. Your mind works like a clock tower, now gears grinding behind your gaze. You reform education. You reshape the legal system. You tell your ministers, we must build a nation that outlives us. But not everyone sees a builder. Some see a tyrant, a usurper. The kings of Europe bristle. The Russian Tsar narrows his eyes. The British whisper war behind their foggy island cliffs. The Prussians sharpen their sabers. You see it all. You know. But you also know something they don't. Speed is strategy. You move fast. Forge alliances like molten iron. You marry Marie Louise of Austria, niece of Marie Antoinette, and in doing so, stitch yourself into the very bloodline that once cast you out. The irony tastes like iron on your tongue. Josephine watches from a villa outside Paris. She does not cry where anyone can see. But your letters to her continue short, respectful, like offerings to a lost god. And in the grand palace halls of your new life, you begin to lose the quiet, the stillness you once used as a weapon. That slow, smoldering patience is now replaced by pacing ministers, endless ceremonies, titles stacked like dominoes. You are Emperor of the French King of Italy, mediator of the Swiss Confederation, protector of the Rhine. You laugh once in your chambers, I've become a collection of hats. Your valet chuckles. You don't. The crown weighs more each day. Not physically, it's surprisingly light, but metaphorically. You feel the drag of every decision, every soldier sent, every treaty broken, every rumor whispered. At night, you sometimes sit alone with maps, not to plan battles, just to look, to remind yourself where you are, who you were. You remember Brienne, the boys who mocked you. You remember Corsica, the salt wind, the dirt paths, your mother's silence. And now, here you are crowned, feared, adored. But you wonder, have I climbed too far to feel the ground anymore? You see yourself reflected in windows, now taller than you really are, your posture stiff with expectation. The people call you Napoleon the Great. Artists paint you as Caesar, as Alexander, as Mars in a uniform. But none of them capture the exhaustion behind your eyes. you still walk fast. But now you are being followed by shadows. Whispers of revolt, murmurs in Spain, a growing coldness in Russia, and within you, the faint echo of something you once felt in Egypt. The higher you rise, the more the air begins to thin. Still, you press forward. Because you know the truth behind every crown, it is not a reward. It is a wager, and you are still willing to bet everything. You are no longer a man. You are momentum. A current of decisions crashing through Europe, blazing through cities, redrawing borders, unseating kings, like rooks on a chessboard. And still, you don't stop moving. You can't. You rise before dawn, even now. Not because you want to, but because sleep has started to feel dangerous. When your eyes close, your mind keeps marching. Campaigns loop behind your lids. Dead friends salute from dreams. And always in the distance, you hear footsteps, yours or history's, or maybe the sound of the ground preparing to vanish beneath you. In your study, maps stretch across the walls like stained glass. Every province is a pressure point. Every river, a vein in the body of Europe. You pace before them like a physician diagnosing a patient on the brink. Spain bleeds. Prussia festers. Austria grits its teeth. And Russia watches. You try to hold the pieces together. You fill thrones with brothers and brothers-in-law, placing Bonapartes like chessmen. But blood is not glue. Loyalty doesn't flow just because the veins match. Some reigns collapse. Some kings embarrass you. One even defects. You once said, a throne is just a plank draped in velvet. Now you begin to see how slippery that velvet really is. Your ministers bring you letters, news, threats. The British refuse to fall. Smug behind their navy, they mock you in print. You respond not with words, but with the continental system, an economic blockade meant to starve their trade. It doesn't work. Not really. Europe doesn't obey systems. It obeys you. But you can't be everywhere. Not yet. So you move faster. You command multiple fronts. Your handwriting, quick slanted, unmistakably impatient, becomes a second currency. Orders fly like flocks of iron birds. Your marshals love you and fear you. You remember once catching Ney staring too long at your back. You turned and said, you wouldn't like the weight marshal. Ney flushed. Didn't speak of it again. You push them harder than any commander would dare. But they follow you because you never ask them to do what you wouldn't do yourself. You ride into battle still. You walk among the wounded. You sleep in tents when they sleep in tents. Even your enemies begin to admit it. He's not just strategy. He's belief. And belief you've learned is stronger than steel. But belief has a cost. In private, your hands shake. You begin to suffer headaches that feel like artillery inside your skull. Your stomach burns no matter what you eat. Some say it's ulcers. Others say it's poison. You don't listen. You take more baths. You write longer letters. You wake in the night and ask your valet. What hour is it, not because you need to know, but because time itself feels like an opponent, and you must know where he stands. Josephine is gone now, her scent still clinging to certain corridors. Marie-Louise gives you a son, a healthy child, a soft thing swaddled in empire. You hold him once and think this is it. This is what it was all for. But you know better. The war isn't over. It was never about a child. Not really. It's about the vision. The shape of the world you saw when you were just a boy with nothing but paper ink and vengeance. And then it happens. At Wagram, At Austerlitz, at Jena, you become unstoppable. The son of Austerlitz, they call you. You maneuver entire armies like a conductor with strings. You see angles where others see fog. You feint, split delay, pin victory, blooming like fire across frozen fields. One general says Napoleon fights like he can see 10 minutes into the future. You don't correct him, because it's almost true. But after every victory, your voice grows quieter. You begin to speak only when necessary. Your eyes retreat deeper into shadow. Officers say you speak with glances. Ministers say you dictate law without raising your tone. Because what's the point of shouting when the world listens to your silence? You eat alone now most nights. The plates arrive warm but untouched. You read files until your vision blurs. Then you fold the paper slowly, precisely, as if the act itself keeps the empire from folding too. And you think briefly of the boy at Brienne. The boy mocked for his accent. The boy who sat alone in dormitories drawing imaginary battlefields. Would he recognize you now, or would he fear you? You smile, just a little, because you're not sure either. Outside your window, Paris sleeps. But your mind is still at war. You thought yourself invincible. The thought didn't come as arrogance, but as evidence. You had bent kingdoms, rewritten borders, built laws that would outlive your soldiers. You had survived betrayal, survived exile, survived silence. Even your failures had bowed to your narrative. So when the decision comes to invade Russia, it doesn't feel like a gamble. It feels like inevitability. They broke the treaty. They opened their ports to Britain. They challenged your authority. What choice do they leave you? You gather an army, unlike anything the world has seen. Nearly 500,000 men march behind your banners. French Poles, Germans, Italians, even reluctant allies. The earth trembles under their boots. You whisper to yourself, "This is not conquest. This is justice." You do not hear the winds begin to stir. The Russian plains stretch before you like a prayer offered in bad faith. Endless, featureless, but you press forward, always forward. Momentum is your heartbeat. Smolensk, skirmishes, small victories. You expect battle, but they don't give it to you. The Russians retreat again and again, burning fields, poisoning wells, lighting their own cities aflame. You march through smoke and ash. Your men look to you, and you nod as if this was part of the plan. It wasn't. But you can't stop now. You're too deep. And then Borodino. One of the bloodiest battles Europe has ever seen. You watch from your command post as bodies collapse in waves. Cannon fire drowns out prayer. The Russian army doesn't break. They bleed and stand. You win technically. They retreat again. But you've never felt victory like this before, gray, uncertain hollow. And then comes Moscow. You enter the ancient capital not with trumpets, but with disbelief. The city is empty, deserted. The bells don't ring. The people are gone. The silence is louder than any cannon, and then it burns. At night, fires bloom across the city like wounds. The wind turns red. The sky opens. Your men scream as flames eat the houses they hope to sleep in. It's not your fire. It's theirs. The Russians burn their own capital rather than let you own it. You sit in a palace, half charred. The ceilings groan. Smoke drips from chandeliers. You write letters home, as if everything is under control. But even your handwriting trembles now. Outside, the first frost comes early, a thin white whisper across rooftops. Your breath becomes visible, and then it gets worse. The cold arrives like an executioner. Your horses die standing up. Men freeze mid-step. Frostbite takes fingers, takes noses, takes hope. The great army begins to crack. Morale dies before the bodies do. The retreat becomes a legend even as it happens. You do not ride at the head. You ride with them, among them, wrapped in furs, face stone still. But you see them, your soldiers chewing leather, drinking melted snow, whispering prayers in 6 languages. The roads are rivers of blood and ice. Wolves follow. So do the Cossacks' riders who appear and vanish like ghosts. They take the slow, the wounded, the unlucky. You keep marching. What else is there? You make it to the Berezina River and find it swollen, iced, and rimmed with enemy guns. You order bridges built in record time. 2 wooden skeletons stretched across oblivion. You lose thousands, but you cross. Barely. When you finally return to France, it is not to cheers. It is to silence, confusion, disbelief. The Grande Armée is gone. Less than 50,000 make it home. Some accounts say fewer than 10,000 were still combat ready, and yet you are alive. The newspapers don't say retreat. They say strategic repositioning. The statues don't weep. The currency still bears your profile. But you feel it now. The tide has turned. You once said the battlefield is the scene of constant chaos. The winner will be the one who controls that chaos. But what happens when chaos outgrows you? You return to Paris gaunt but unbowed. You pretend you are not haunted. But at night the frost comes back. In dreams, you walk through the hollow of Moscow. You watch your soldiers freeze again and again. Sometimes you reach for them. Sometimes they reach for you. Always you wake cold, even in warm rooms, even under heavy blankets, even in the heart of your empire. Because frost doesn't melt. Not all of it. Some of it lives inside you now. Right behind the heart, just beneath the fire, the sea is too quiet. That's the first thing you notice. Elba isn't exile, it's a mirror. A small, jagged island, tossed between the hills of Tuscany and the restless horizon, where time stretches out, like the waves, endless, repetitive, and indifferent. You arrive not as a prisoner, but as a joke. Europe laughs behind its lace gloves. They call you the Emperor of Elba, as if the title itself were satire, and in a way it is. You are given 400 guards, a tiny fleet of toy ships, and the sovereignty of a rock barely large enough to cast a shadow on history. But you are still Napoleon. And so, you do what you always do. You organize. You build roads. You reform taxes. You establish schools, sanitation, even a theater. You hold parades with your miniature army, review their lines, with the same sharp eye you once cast across the Alps. You even wear the uniform every morning, tailored, pressed, clean. You walk the island like it's a capital, like you're preparing for guests who never arrive. The locals adore you. Children salute you. Fishermen bring you updates as if you're still directing a continent. They don't understand that you're not rehearsing rulership, you're rehearsing return. Because this isn't surrender. This is intermission. You listen to every ship that passes Elba. You memorize the timetables of visiting merchants. You bribe captains with small fortunes to carry your letters out into the world. From your small desk overlooking the harbor, you write page after page in code. To loyalists, to spies, to old soldiers still watching the winds in France. You hear rumors that the Bourbons have returned with their ancient ways and powdered wigs, that Paris grows restless under the weight of monarchy's shadow, that your name, once banished, is being whispered again in taverns, in barracks, in the worn corners of lonely memory. One evening, a Corsican officer hands you a sealed note. No signature, just 5 words. They miss the emperor's pace. You smile. That night you stare across the water. The stars ripple in the dark like coins tossed by gods. You remember Austerlitz, the fog at Jena, the sunlight on your troops before Wagram. You remember how it felt to move history with your fingertips, and you whisper aloud, "I am not done." Your guards drink wine and sleep deeply. You make a plan, not reckless, not desperate, inevitable. Your fleet is readied in secret. Just 7 ships, barely armed. A few hundred loyal men and the courage of memory. You don't need an army. You only need to land. Because you know France remembers. You depart under moonlight. The breeze is soft. The air full of salt and silence. You stand on the deck like a ghost walking back into its legend. The French coastline appears like a dream on the edge of dawn. And as your boots hit sand, you feel it in your bones. This is not a return. This is a resurrection. Word spreads faster than the wind. By the time you reach Grenoble, the royal troops are waiting, muskets loaded. Orders given, you dismount. Step forward alone. Raise your voice not as a soldier, but as a memory. If any of you would shoot your emperor here, I stand. Silence. Then one rifle drops, then another. A cheer, a cry, a wave. They rush toward you, arms outstretched, uniforms weeping with joy. You are back. Not by force, by remembrance. You march, town by town, village by village. They call it the 100 days, but to you it feels like one long heartbeat. Josephine is gone. France is fractured. The world is waiting to crush you again. But for a few moments, for one last breath, Europe pauses, because you have returned, not as a conqueror, but as an echo strong enough to become thunder again. You land on the shores of France like a memory that refuses to stay buried. There's no army waiting, no parade, just a whisper through the mountains that the man they once crowned and then exiled has returned. One step on the beach at Golfe Juan, and your name becomes dangerous again. Not a name, really. A drumbeat, a fever, Napoleon. You ride north on a borrowed horse, your boots still dusted with Elba's dirt, and every hoofbeat is a gamble. Will they arrest you? Will they cheer? You don't bring an army. You bring a question. Do you remember what it felt like when we believed in something together? They do. First it's a farmer, then a town, then a battalion. Soldiers once sworn to destroy you weep when they see your face. You raise your hand. No gun, no command, just that familiar glove gesture, and say, "If you would shoot your emperor, do it now." No one moves. Then a roar. Not bullets, loyalty. And so begins the 100 days, your last waltz with destiny. Not a campaign. A heartbeat. A ripple across time. You ride into Paris like a ghost refusing exorcism, and the streets erupt. The throne is empty. The republic is brittle. The people are tired of kings and liars. You fill the vacuum not with speeches, but with presence. In the chambers of power, old men mutter warnings. He'll unravel everything. But others lean forward. He's the only one who knows how to hold a nation in his fist without crushing it. You don't crown yourself this time. You don't need to. For a brief, impossible moment, it feels as if the clock has turned back. As if exile were a fever dream, as if you could still outrun fate. But even as you sign proclamations and rebuild the army, you know what's coming. Europe doesn't forget. The monarchs do not forgive. They gather again, the Austrians, the Prussians, the British. They are tired of your returns. You move fast. You always do. Belgium, Wellington, Waterloo. You ride out one morning before dawn, wrapped in mist and calculation. You study the fields like they're equations. You see ridges, hedges, roads, possibilities. You say aloud, almost to yourself, "This will be the last time." Your generals shift in the saddle. They know you too well to ask what you mean. The day begins with thunder, not from the heavens, but from your cannons. You press the advantage. Your tactics still work. Almost. But something's changed. Not you. The world. The Prussians arrive faster than expected. The coordination slips. Ney charges too early. Grouchy doesn't arrive. The field turns into mud and fire, and the illusion, the one you've worn like armor, cracks. You pace. You command. You urge the men forward. But the magic is waning, and when the Imperial Guard, the very soul of your legend, begins to break, it happens in silence. No cry, no panic. Just a slow folding in on itself, like a star collapsing. You watch it happen, and you understand this is not defeat. This is finality. As the smoke clears, you ride off the field, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man who gambled with time and lost by minutes. In the days that follow, you try diplomacy. You try delay. But even the wind sounds tired of your voice. Paris turns cold. The chambers close. Allies vanish. This time, there's no Elba, no villa, no ribbon-wrapped myth. They send you to St. Helena, a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. Not exile, erasure. As your ship sails away, you stand at the stern, watching the French coastline fade. You don't weep. You don't speak. But deep inside, something slows. Not your heart. Just your heartbeat in history. You replay it in your mind endlessly. Not the chaos, not the guns, but the moment just before. The air at Waterloo was thick with heat, damp with anticipation. You remember the sky low and pale, like breath held in a chest. The ground sodden from rain, the mud grasping at boots like hands from below. The field stretched out before you, not as land, but as outcome. Each hedge, each hill, each inch of elevation possibility, and peril dressed in the same coat. You knew that silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of fate winding back its fist. You rode the line that morning, nodding to your soldiers, your hat low, your coat tightly buttoned against the wind. The veterans stared ahead, eyes hard. The young ones looked at you like you were already a statue. They cheered you softly, but you could feel it somewhere deep beneath the songs and salutes, a weariness that even glory couldn't erase. You had been here too many times, not in geography, but in pattern. Everything was familiar, and that was the danger. You thought you could break the cycle by force of will. That victory, like everything else in your life, could be wrestled into submission. But Waterloo didn't want to be conquered. Your men fought like the earth depended on it. Ney led charge after charge, with fire in his lungs, but the British line held like granite soaked in gunpowder. You sent wave after wave of cavalry, the drums pounding, like your own heartbeat echoing back at you. You watched from the ridge as the tide failed to turn. Every decision felt almost right. Every maneuver just a little too late. You kept looking to the horizon, waiting for Grouchy's reinforcements. But Grouchy never came. Blücher did. And when the Prussians poured onto the field like a flood, you felt time compress. Not hours, your entire life. You watched it collapse into that moment. And there, on the field of Waterloo, it hit you. This is how myths end. Not with a betrayal, not with a bullet, with accumulation of miscalculations, of tired men, of timing no longer yours to command. The Imperial Guard held, then trembled, then folded. You saw them break. You saw them run. And with that, the silence returned. The kind that rings in your ears louder than cannon fire. The kind that swallows the soul of an empire and says, "Now you rest." You didn't shout. You didn't cry. You just stood there, your boots sunk in Belgian mud, your greatcoat stained with smoke and disbelief. A soldier near you muttered, "La garde recule." It wasn't a statement. It was a funeral bell. You turned your horse. You rode away from the field without a backward glance. There was no dignity left in the dirt. By nightfall, you were a fugitive of history. By morning, you were no longer emperor, just Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose shadow had outgrown its owner. You returned to Paris, but the city had moved on. The magic was gone. The corridors of power were colder than the battlefield. The names you once whispered into medals now whispered your replacement. They said you would flee to America. You didn't. You considered suicide? You didn't. Instead, you did what you always did best. You chose the optics of surrender. You boarded the British ship, HMS Bellerophon. You handed yourself over not as a prisoner, but as a former monarch seeking protection. You wrote a letter. To the Prince Regent of England, I come like Themistocles to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people. They didn't care. You weren't Themistocles. You were a political problem, a relic, a liability too dangerous to leave alive, too famous to quietly execute. So they exiled you again, but this time there would be no escape. As the Bellerophon sailed toward St. Helena, you stood on the deck eyes, fixed not on the sea, but on the sky. It had always been the sky you watched. At Brienne, in Italy, in Egypt. And now, as a cage of waves closed around you, you stared up, as if waiting for the stars to explain why they'd stopped listening. You said nothing, but the silence was not stillness, not in your mind. You waked to the sound of wind slapping the shutters every morning, the same gray breath, the same damp air. The sea is endless here, not poetic, not inspiring, just there like a weight pressing down on the horizon. St. Helena isn't a prison, it's a forgetting. You are 51, once emperor of the French ruler of half of Europe. Now, a patient, a tenant, a ghost with a pension and a leaking roof. You walk the cliffs every morning, a black coat wrapped tightly around your aging frame, boots scraping volcanic rock. The soldiers posted to watch you avert their eyes when you pass. Not from respect, from discomfort. You are no longer dangerous, but you are not harmless either. You still command space. That hasn't faded. But something else has. Time. Here, time is a flat circle. Breakfast, dictation, walk, dinner, insomnia, repeat. You measure your life now in coughs and ink stains, in how many pages you manage to revise, in how often the rain leaks through the ceiling of Longwood House and into your soup. You dictate your memoirs to men who still believe in you. La Case Gourgot Montolon. They scribble as you pace. You stop often not for drama, but for breath. Your body is failing. Your stomach burns. Some days your legs ache so badly you can't rise. You joke gently that the British are trying to assassinate you with boredom. It's not really a joke. Governor Hudson Lowe runs the island like a paranoid accountant. He counts your spoons. He censors your letters. He denies your requests for more firewood, more books, more life. You despise him, not for his cruelty, but for his lack of imagination. History, you mutter one night, will forget his name. Then you return to your writing. You try to shape your legacy like a sculptor with cracked tools. You paint yourself as the child of destiny, the soldier of the revolution, the bringer of laws. You minimize the failures, romanticize the victories. You are not rewriting the truth, just rearranging it for posterity. You say things like, I have worn the crown of Charlemagne and the chains of Prometheus. Or, they wanted me to be Caesar, but I would have been Solon. You believe them. On good days. On bad days, you say nothing. Josephine haunts you more than politics. Some nights, her perfume rises in your dreams. You whisper to her in your sleep. You wake with tears dried on your cheeks, and no one is there to see. The island grows smaller as your world dims. You have visitors. Some are French loyalists. Some are curious Englishmen. One asks if you regret invading Russia. You say, I regret nothing except not dying at Austerlitz. He doesn't laugh. You weren't trying to be funny. You watch the Atlantic from your porch for hours, trying to remember what ambition felt like when it was still hungry. You watch the waves and think of maps you'll never redraw, cities you'll never enter again, statues they've already started building in your absence. Sometimes you pick up a stone and imagine throwing it back across the sea toward Paris, toward Vienna, toward history. But your arm is weak now. The stone falls flat. Still, you remember everything. You remember the heat of cannon barrels at Lodi, the cold stillness of Tilsit, the wild crowd in Milan, the hush in the cathedral when you crowned yourself. And most of all, you remember movement, how everything used to respond to your will, the way your presence could bend hours. Now time refuses to obey. The pain sharpens. Your doctors argue ulcer cancer divine punishment. You stop caring what name it has. It wins either way. You ask to be buried on the banks of the Seine. They nod. But you know they won't do it. One evening, you call for your son's portrait. You stare at it for an hour. You wonder if the boy remembers your voice, if he ever knew your hands. I ruled for him, you whisper. And yet he'll grow up in Vienna, not even knowing me. No answer comes. Your heart beats slower each night. And one morning, the wind is calmer. The shutters don't slap. The rain doesn't come. You lie back, your fingers curled, as if still gripping reins. You say softly, France Army, head of the army, Josephine, and then silence. Not exile, not punishment. Just the end of a rhythm too immense to sustain. The world doesn't stop, but somewhere in the soft hush of St. Helena's wind, it remembers you. For a moment. Not as emperor, not as tyrant, but as a man caged not by walls but by time. Years pass. Decades. You are no longer breath and bone, but stone and story. They bring your body home at last, floating down the Seine beneath gray Paris skies as crowds gather in reverent silence. They call it a return, a reconciliation. But no one asks if it's what you would have wanted. You had asked for burial along the Seine, yes, but not like this. Not in marble and pageantry, not under layers of political guilt and gilded remorse. Yet this is how empires mourn their myths. They sculpt them in silence, dress them in flags, and bury them beneath churches they once dared to outshine. You lie now, beneath the dome of Les Invalides, entombed in porphyry, wrapped in layers of ceremony, like a god that once walked among men and then vanished into smoke. Tourists shuffle past your tomb, with awe in their throats. They whisper your name with reverence, confusion, wonder. They see only the scale of you, the weight, not the boy from Corsica who whispered strategy in his dreams, not the man who paced deserts in search of eternity, just the monument, just the marble, just the myth. But still, echoes remain. Somewhere in Brienne, the school bell still tolls in winter. Somewhere in Toulon, a coastal wind brushes the ridge where you first saw your own reflection in fire. Somewhere in Paris, a boy stares at a map, thinking not of lines and capitals, but of what could be moved if only one dared to move it. Your legacy is not in laws or borders. It's in momentum. You proved what one mind could do, how high it could climb, how far it could fall, and how much light it could cast before the flame consumed itself. You were never just a general. You were a rhythm, a beat between revolutions, a tide that refused to recede until it had redrawn the coast. And now, long after, the swords are sheathed, and the treaties faded, and the names of your enemies forgotten, you still linger. In books, in statues, in nightmares, in dreams, in the hush of museums and the thunder of lectures, but most of all, in questions. Could it have ended differently? Were you hero or tyrant? Was your rise inevitable? Your fall just? The world never agrees, and that is the final proof of your power. Because the truly immortal are not those who conquer land. They are those who fracture time, who crack the present open wide enough for the future to step through. You were a fracture Napoleon, a fault line in the age of kings, a vision carved into the bones of Europe, one that still aches when the weather shifts. And as the wind stirs the leaves along the Seine, it does not carry your name like a shout. It carries it like a breath. Napoleon, soft, inevitable, forever circling. And now, as the final embers of this long journey fade into the quiet, let your mind rest. You've walked the halls of empire. You've stood beside pyramids, under stars. You've heard cannons kiss his betrayal, and prophecy woven into the strange, still heartbeat of one unforgettable life. Let the images soften now. Let the battles drift into mist. Let Josephine's smile be the last memory that stays. The world of Napoleon was vast, loud, and burning. But here, in the calm, after everything we find something else, the gentle truth that even legends grow tired, and that all empires, even those carved in ambition and fury, eventually yield to silence. And as you lie in your own bed now, whether it's past midnight or just before dawn, feel the stillness gather around you. Breathe in, let it go. Close your eyes to the windswept cliffs of St. Helena. Let the ocean become a lullaby. Let the marble tomb become a cradle of memory, not grief. The world continues as it always does. But tonight, you've stepped into history. You've listened with heart and patience. You've honored the rise and the fall of a man who tried to bend time itself. And now it's your time to rest. So from here, gently, quietly, Good night, and may your dreams be vast enough to hold the whole of history.